This is a story about a high limestone ridge in what is now southeastern Turkey, more than 10,000 years ago, before cities, before farming, before pottery, before writing. A story about hunter-gatherers who quarried stone and raised pillars and gathered in great numbers on a wind-swept summit, and about the ordinary people whose hands carried that work. A young woman learning the keeping of the dead, a child who collects feathers, a man who has spent a lifetime listening through stone. Picture the ridge in the last hour before dawn. The limestone is still cool from the night, pale as bone where the wind has scoured it clean. South and east, the steppe falls away in long folds toward the horizon. Open grassland glowing faintly under the early sky. Oak and pistachio woodlands gathered in the lower valleys like dark pools. On a clear day, from the highest point of the summit, the eye carries all the way to what will one day be called Syria. No one chose this ridge by accident. Wild einkorn moves in the first wind. It has not yet occurred to anyone to plant it. The grasses bend and rise as they have bent and risen for 1,000 mornings, and the gazelles that will pass beneath the ridge in late summer are still grazing somewhere far to the south, and the great wild cattle move in their slow herds through country no one yet calls anything. The village wakes around the natural dip in the hillside. Smoke begins to thread up from the flat roofs. Pistachio wood smoke, sweet and resinous, the smell that will hang over the ridge through every season of these people's lives. Down in the dip itself, half in shadow, the rings of T-pillars stand faceless in the half-light, their carved animals not yet warmed by sun. A fox here, a vulture there, the curl of a snake. They are waiting, the way old things wait. And then, before the first true light, the sound begins. One handstone, somewhere on a rooftop, then another, then a third. Within a few breaths, the percussion of grain grinding is rising from the whole village at once. The steady, uneven, communal rhythm that will carry through the day, that has carried through every day anyone here can remember. On one of the rooftops, a young woman sits cross-legged near a banked hearth. She is not grinding. Beside her is a covered bowl, the cloth weighted at its edges with small stones. Her hands rest on her knees. She is looking south, toward the place where the steppe softens into the dawn haze, and her face holds the particular stillness of someone who has not slept well. Her name is Naren. The bowl beside her is for work she has not yet been able to begin. Below, in the workyard, another woman is already mixing the morning's pigments. The mortuary workspace is a low-walled room set against the slope, its roof beams of juniper, its floor smoothed lime plaster. A terrazzo finish a generation of women have walked smooth. Saral is already at her bench when Naren comes down the ladder. The light through the doorway is still gray. Saral has a small stone bowl between her knees and a lump of red ochre in her left hand, and she is rubbing the ochre against a flat grinding stone with her right, slow, steady, the powder coming off the stone in fine drifts. Beside her, in a smaller dish, is a pat of rendered fat, pale, faintly yellow, taken last autumn from a particular boar Saral had asked for and remembered. She works the powder in by feel. She does not measure. She has been mixing this paste since before Naren was born. Naren sits on the low bench across from her without speaking. Saral does not look up. Saral asks for the cloths. Naren brings the cloths. They are folded squares of soft hide. scraped thin, kept in a basket beneath the bench. She lays 3 out on the workbench, 1 for each of the skulls Cyril has already set in their places. There they are, in the early light, 2 on the long bench by the doorway, ready to be carried back to the enclosure today and placed in their final keeping. 1 on a separate ledge, to be carried forward, kept among the living a while longer, its cord still strong, its ochre still fresh enough that it will only need touching up before it goes back into the niche of the household it belongs to. And on the small bench at the back of the room, alone, a 4th. Cyril nods toward the bench by the door. The 2 there go down with the burial. The work today is to bring their ochre full again. She nods toward the ledge. He stays, light hand on him, only the temples. Her chin lifts slightly toward the back. Tsayan. She does not say that Tsayan is for Naren. She has said it for 2 days. She does not say it again. Naren's eyes go to the back bench and slide off. She picks up one of the hide cloths and begins to unfold it for no particular reason, then folds it again. Saral keeps grinding. The ochre comes off the stone in a small red drift, settles, lifts, settles. The room smells of fat and pistachio wood smoke from the banked fire in the corner, and very faintly of the bone itself, clean, mineral, the smell of a thing that has been carefully prepared. On the workbench beside the bowl lie Veshi's microblades from the last batch, slender flakes of flint 2 finger widths long, edges so fine they catch the light like wet things. Saral uses them for the grooves. The grooves run front to back across the crown, deep parallel lines worked in patiently with the blade held at a low angle, deepened over days. They are not decoration. They keep the cord from slipping when the skull is hung. The drilled hole at the back takes the cord. The grooves hold the cord in place. The lower jaw, lashed beneath, comes along. This is how the dead stay. This is how a grandmother who held a small child can still be in the rafters when that child is old, watching without eyes, present without weight. It is patient work. It is not solemn work. Saral hums sometimes under her breath. She corrects Naren's mistakes by reaching across and moving Naren's hand a finger's width and saying nothing. Today she is not humming. She tips the ochre into the dish with the fat. She begins to work the 2 together with the flat of a wooden spatula, pressing, folding, pressing again. The paste deepens from grit to a slow, rich red. Cyril lifts the spatula, watches the way the paste falls back, adds a breath more fat, works it again. Her hand on the rim of the bowl steadies it the way a potter would steady a wheel, if anyone here had yet thought of a wheel. Naren watches that hand. It is the same hand, the same grip on the same rim of the same bowl, the thumb crooked just so along the lip. The winter they prepared Eshet, 2 winters ago now, Saral's hand had been on this bowl exactly this way, while Naren had sat where she sits now, Naren's own hands shaking too much to hold the drill, Saral's other hand coming over to steady hers, guiding the bit through the bone of Naren's sister at the place where the cord would go. Saral does not look up. She knows Naren is watching her hand. She does not move her hand. After a while, she sets the spatula down and tips the bowl gently and looks at the paste against the stone. The paste is good. It will hold through the day. She reaches across and slides the bowl to the center of the bench between them. She covers it with a square of hide weighted with a small, smooth stone, in the way Naren had covered her own bowl on the rooftop above. Then she stands and goes to the bench by the door and lifts the first of the 2 skulls, the one with the smaller suspension hole, an old man whose name Naran does not now remember, though Saral surely does, and brings it to her own working place and sits down with it cradled in her lap as easily as a person cradles a sleeping child. She picks up one of Veshi's microblades. Without looking up, she lets Naran know the paste is ready when she is. She does not say more. Naran sits a moment longer. The grinding of the village above and around them is full now. The rooftop percussion of 100 handstones, women and girls leaning into the morning's grain. From the workyard outside comes the laugh of a child and a woman calling. Mihal's voice and her mother's, sharper and farther, and the steady distant chalk of a flint pick somewhere down the slope where the quarry workers have already begun. Naran stands. She does not look at the back bench. She steps past Saral, past the covered bowl, and out through the low doorway into the light. The workyard at mid-morning is the loudest place on the ridge. Picture a long, shallow space worn smooth by years of feet, scattered with grindstones turned up to the sun like pale shells, and at its edges the low buff stone walls of houses leaning into the slope. Women sit on hides with handstones moving over the lower bowls, and the percussion they make is not separate sounds, but one sound. A long rolling murmur of stone on stone that the village lives inside the way a fish lives inside a river. The grain dust rises around them in thin pale clouds and settles on their hair and their forearms and the rims of the bowls. By midday, it will settle on the food, and they will eat it without thought. Naran steps into the yard, and the sound closes over her. It was a sound she had ground inside since she was small enough to be set between her mother's knees and given a stone of her own to push back and forth. There was comfort in it. There was, this morning, also the strange, far-off feeling of hearing a familiar voice through water. A child crossed her path at a run, stopped, doubled back. Mihal, Saral's youngest, 8 summers, all elbows and intent. Her pouch hung crosswise at her waist, bulging with the small treasures she gathered everywhere she went and never quite finished naming. She had been to the cistern already. Her hem was dark with water. Mihal greeted her aunt and held out her cupped hands. Inside lay a pale feather, the soft brown gray of a lark, its barbs perfect. From the cistern wall, Mihal explained, caught on the lip, no bird, only this. She lifted it to her own cheek a moment, considering, then tucked it carefully into the pouch beside whatever else lived there, a duck's wing covert, a fox tooth, 2 pistachio shells split clean. The pouch had its own small weather inside it. Naran found, to her surprise, that she was smiling and told her to keep it dry. Mihal was already running again. She knew, she called back, her voice trailing over her shoulder toward the lower slope. Across the yard, Yelet passed at her unhurried walk. She carried her flax fiber rope wound twice around her wrist, as she always did when she was on her way to a measuring, the loose end dropping nearly to her knee. She did not stop. She lifted a hand to Naran and to the women at the grindstones and went on, her eyes on the cleared ground above. Somewhere up the slope a child laughed and was hushed. Yelet turned her head a quarter inch toward the sound and walked on. Beyond Yelet, far down the slope where the quarry track came up out of the rocks, a figure was climbing, slowly, the way a man climbs who has been on his feet since before light. Tepe. Even at this distance, Naran knew his shape, the slight forward lean, the way he set his feet on stones rather than between them. He would come into the yard before noon. would speak with the women about the gazelle scouts and with Yelet about the bedrock, would touch a child's head in passing, would drink water and eat nothing and go on. He was 60 winters at least, and walked like a man who had decided long ago that the ridge belonged to him, or he to it. The distinction did not seem to matter to him. Naren turned away from the climb and crossed the yard toward the small, low building at its far end. Space for one workbench, one window slit, one doorway low enough that a man had to bow to enter. The flint workshop. Even from outside it had its own air, the dry mineral smell of fresh broken stone, a smell sharper than any other smell in the village, almost cold. The chalk and tap of working came from inside, steady and unhurried. She stooped through the doorway. Vesci was at his bench with his back half to the door, a pad of folded hide across his thigh and a core of dark flint braced on it. The floor around his feet was thick with debitage, the small, sharp flakes that fell away from every strike, a glittering gray carpet that crunched faintly when he shifted. On the shelf above the bench lay the long, curved bone of an aurochs, with a flint point still wedged deep into it, the hunter's tool buried in the hunter's quarry, kept all these years for no reason Vesci could put into words. Beside it, an antler hammer worn smooth at the grip, and a rod of hard bone, and a slimmer rod of softer bone, and 3 small flat stones laid out in a row. He was working a microblade. The core had been prepared for it over hours. The blade itself would come away in a single pressure stroke, as long as a finger and no wider than a stalk of grass. He was bracing the rod of bone against the platform's edge with both hands, his jaw set, the muscles of his forearms standing out under the dust. He did not look up. She did not greet him. He preferred not to be greeted while a blade was coming. The pressure went into the bone, through the bone, into the stone. There was a small, bright sound, the kind of sound that, on the ridge, never came from anything but this, and the blade lifted away clean. Vesci exhaled. He set the rod down. He turned the blade between his fingers, holding it up to the window slit, watching the light run along its edge. Then he set it on a folded scrap of hide beside 3 others he had already made this morning, all of them perfect. What Naren did not know, watching the bone rod sit in his hand, was that the grip of his fingers along its length had been taught to him by his uncle, who had been taught by another and another, in a chain of hands that ran back across the steppes and the mountains and the great inland seas. The way the rod met the platform's edge, the angle of the wrist, the breath held just before the press, all of it was older than the village, older than the pillars, carried across distances no one here had ever counted in the hands of people who had never known they were carrying anything at all. Vesci himself asked, would only have shrugged and said his uncle had shown him. He turned, finally, and saw her. Whatever was in her face, she did not know what was in her face. He registered it without surprise and without question. He did not ask. He reached for the hide on which the morning's blades lay and selected 3, the smallest, the second smallest, and one of the long ones for the deeper grooves. He laid them out on a square of softer hide and folded it twice, the way a person wraps something for travel. Then he hesitated. He looked again at the blade he had just made, the one he had been finishing for himself, the long, fine one whose light he had been watching when she came in. He picked it up. He held it on his palm a moment, weighing nothing, considering. Then he laid it in the fold with the others and closed the hide over it. He held the small bundle out to her across the bench. He said it was for the work. She took it. The bundle was almost weightless. She felt through the hide the long, fine edge of the blade he had not meant to give away. She wanted to say something. The shape of it gathered in her chest and would not come up. He had already turned back to the bench. He picked up the next core. He set it on the hide on his thigh. He braced the rod of bone. She slid the bundle into her belt, beside the place where, without remembering when she had done it, she had earlier tucked a single split pistachio shell from the floor of the rooftop. She felt the shell against her hip and the bundle of blades against her hip, and stood a moment longer in the smell of cold stone. Then she stooped under the lintel and went out, and the percussion of the yard came back over her, and she did not turn toward the workspace where Sarah sat with the old man cradled in her lap. She turned instead toward the dip in the hillside where the great enclosure waited in its quiet. The path down to the dip was worn smooth by generations of feet. She took it slowly. Behind her, the percussion of the grindstones grew thinner, layer by layer, as though she were walking down through water and leaving the surface above. The wind that had been steady on the rooftop broke against the rim of the hollow and went elsewhere. By the time she reached the entry, the village sounded very far away. The enclosure had been cut into the natural fold of the slope, so that one came at it from above and stepped down into it through an opening in the roof. She paused at the lip. The interior breathed up at her, cool air smelling of dry stone and old smoke and something faintly mineral, the way a deep well smells. She lowered herself onto the first step and then the next, and then she was inside. The light came down behind her in a narrow column. It struck the floor first and lay there in a pale square, and the rest of the room held the dimness it had held since morning. She let her eyes find their measure. The two great central pillars rose from the floor and did not stop rising. 5 times her height, perhaps more. Their tops, broad and flat, hung above her like the lintels of a doorway no one would ever pass through. Around the wall, the smaller pillars stood in their ring, each one set deep into the stone bench that ran the inside of the enclosure, so that to sit on the bench was to sit between two of them, shoulder to shoulder with the carved. She did not sit. She walked. The first pillar was foxes, 3 of them, one above the other, slim and long-tailed, their bodies caught in the shallow lift of the relief as though they were moving along the stone and had only paused. She set her palm on the lowest. The limestone was cool, not cold. Under her hand, the carved back of the fox was a low ridge, no higher than the edge of a fingernail, and yet the animal was entirely there. The set of the shoulders, the carriage of the head, the angle of an ear pricked toward something the carver had not bothered to show. Whoever had made this fox had watched foxes for a long time. She moved her hand along its flank and stepped on. Snakes next, on the second pillar, many of them woven down the stone in a tight braid of bodies, each scale picked out with the patience of someone who had nothing better to do and nowhere else to be. On the pillar after, cranes, their long legs folded under them as if waiting. Beyond the cranes, a boar, low and heavy, snout to the ground. She came around the curve to the painted one. She knew it was there. She had seen it many times. Even so, in the dim, the colors held her. The boar stood out from the wall in full round, not relief, but a body of stone shouldered free of the pillar, and across his back and along his flanks the old pigment still lay where it had been laid, red along the spine, white at the belly and snout, black ringing the eye and along the line of the bristled back. The black had not faded the way the others had. It looked wet. She did not touch the boar. She stood before him and let her gaze move along him from snout to tail and back, the way she would let her gaze move along the body of a person she had known a long time. When she went on, her hand was trembling slightly. She did not know why. She came at last to Pillar 43, the vulture stone. The figure that had been carved across its face was not a single animal, but a gathering, a vulture with its great wings opened wide, the feathers of each wing carved one by one, each pinion. Beneath one wing, a small headless human form. Above the wing's curve, a disc, round and plain. Around them, at the edges, the others, a scorpion low down, a snake along the side, a crane standing tall. She had stood before this stone many times. Today she stood before it longer. She thought of nothing in particular. She thought of the down Michal had not yet given her. She thought of the cord through bone. She thought of how the vulture rising did not look down. A small sound at the entry, a foot on stone. She did not turn. Yelet's voice came down quietly. She would wait. She did not come in. The enclosures were small places, and a person inside was given the room she had asked for by entering. Yelet sat herself at the lip of the entry where she had set her rope and waited. Naren completed her circle. She came back past the boar, past the cranes, past the snakes, past the foxes. She set her hand a last time on the central pillar, the one nearest the steps, on the wide belt carved across its middle with its circular buckle, on the bend of the stone arms that came around toward the front, on the long flat hands that almost met above the buckle. She did not look up at the head. The head had no eyes to meet. The pillar was a person, and the person was not looking at her, and that was the whole point. One did not come here to be seen. One came here to be among. She climbed the steps. The light at the top widened and took her. Yelet was on her feet, her rope already over her shoulder, looking not at Naren but past her, up the slope to the ground that had been cleared. They would want her up there, Naren said. Her voice came out level. Yelet only nodded. She turned, and Naren turned with her, and together they began to climb. The cleared ground lay above the dip in the hillside. On a shoulder of the ridge, where the limestone shelved out wide and flat under a thin skin of soil that had been scraped back to bare stone, the view from here opened the whole world. To the south, the steppe ran out in long, pale folds toward the haze where, on a clear morning, the eye could carry as far as the distant country that would one day be called Syria. To the west, the grasslands rolled into oak and pistachio. To the north, the higher ground stepped up toward the mountains. A person standing here could hold the country in her gaze the way she held a bowl in her hands. The ridge had not been chosen by accident. No one alive remembered the choosing. The choosing had been done a long time ago, and the rightness of it was simply the air one breathed up here. Yelet unwound her rope from her shoulder. It was flax fiber, plied tight, darkened along its length by the oils of her palms and the dust of many seasons. She had cut it herself in a year Naren could remember as a child. Yelet sitting on a roof in late summer with a heap of retted stalks beside her, working the fibers between her fingers, and a younger woman who would later go to another camp watching how it was done. The rope was not long. It did not need to be. It only needed to be 3 lengths, each the same. Yelet laid one end at a stone she had set yesterday and walked the rope out across the cleared ground. She did not measure with her eye. She measured with the rope, which was the measure. At the rope's end, she pressed a small chip of limestone into the dust. Then she pivoted on that stone and walked the rope back, stretching it taut, and brought the far end around in a slow arc until the line came tight against the first stone again. Where the arc touched the dust, she set another chip. Then she did it once more from the second stone, sweeping the rope, and where the 2 arcs crossed, she set the third. 3 points, 3 stones. The triangle stood in the dust as plainly as if it had always been there. Naren watched. She had seen Yelet do this before, but never alone, never standing in the place of a person whose work it might one day be to carry the rope. Yelet did not look at her as she worked. Yelet did not look at anyone as she worked. Her eyes stayed on the line, on the stone, on the small adjustments her hands made without consulting her. The geometry was in her wrists. It was not a thought she was thinking. It was a thing she did. A footfall came up the slope behind them. Tepe, returning from the quarry, his hair gray with limestone dust, the dust ground into the creases of his hands and the seams of his belt. He nodded to Yelet, set a hand briefly on Naren's shoulder in passing, and walked the triangle. He did not ask where the points were. He saw where the points were. He stopped at the first and lowered himself to one knee and laid his palm flat on the bedrock. He kept it there a while. Then he moved to the second point and did the same. Then the third. It was a thing he did with his hand, and a thing he did with his ear pressed against the back of his hand, and a thing he did with the years that had taught his hand and his ear what to listen for. Stone was not uniform. Stone had grain and flaw, a thickness above whatever lay beneath, a sound under a knuckle that told him whether the bedrock here was deep or shallow, whether a pillar of the size they wanted could be cut from below this ground, or whether the bedrock would betray him halfway through and crack across a hidden seam. Tepe had walked away from a 7-meter pillar in his younger days when the seam had opened under his pick. The pillar lay in the quarry still, on its side, half cut, the work of months abandoned. He had told Naren the story once when she was small. He had not told it as a regret. He moved his palm a hand's breadth and listened again. He grunted, low. It was good here, he said. Yelet came over and crouched beside him. She put her own palm down, more out of companionship than need, and the two of them stayed there, not speaking, the way 2 people who have walked a ridge together for 40 years stay near each other in the work. After a time, Tepe sat back on his heels and looked out over the steppe. Not like the one Iruk and he had tried to lift, he said. The name passed between them and went on. Yelet did not answer. She did not need to. The name had been said, and the saying of it was the whole of what was needed. A man who had stood at the other end of a rope a long time ago in the wrong stone, and who had since gone wherever the dead go when they are not kept. Tepe stood up slowly, his knees finding the angle of standing in their own time. He brushed his palms against each other, and the limestone dust rose pale into the air. The triangle they had set was smaller than the great enclosures below. The new ring would be smaller. The next one after it, smaller still. None of them spoke of this. It was simply how the ridge had been making rings for as long as anyone remembered. Each ring smaller than the one before, each ring careful, each ring laid down in its season when the time came. The sacred was not eternal. The sacred was a thing they did again and again, smaller and smaller, until one day they laid it down for good. A child's voice came up the slope. Below, in the workyard, Michal was crossing toward the cisterns with a bundle of something in her arms. Yelet's eyes went to her. Yelet's eyes stayed on her a moment longer than a woman watches a child she happens to see passing. Then Yelet looked away and bent and began coiling her rope. A messenger came up the path at a trot, dust on his shins. The gazelle scouts had come back. Tepe lifted his chin and went down to hear them. Yelet shouldered her rope and followed at her own pace. Naren stood a moment longer on the cleared ground. Then she, too, went down alone. The workspace was empty when she came back to it. Sarel had gone. To the troughs, perhaps, or to one of the other households, or up to the ridge to speak with someone about the day's work. The lamp had been left unlit. Afternoon light came in through the entry from above and lay in a pale square on the floor, moving slowly as the sun moved. Naren stood in the doorway a long moment before she went in. Chayan was on his bench at the back, just as he had been in the morning. The grooves Saral had cut into him were deep and even, the suspension hole drilled clean. What remained was the ochre, temple to temple in the way Saral had taught her, the pigment laid into the bone with a small wooden tool that had been in this workspace longer than anyone could remember, and then the cord, and the toggle, and the carrying forward. It was an afternoon's work. She had done it many times. She set out the materials, the flat stone for mixing, the pouch of red ochre, the small clay-lined dish where the rendered fat was kept cool. The morning's mix was still good. Saral's mixes lasted a day, sometimes two, but Naren did not use it. She mixed fresh. She measured the ochre by the small bone spoon and the fat by feel, and worked the two together with the heel of her hand the way Saral worked them, until the color came up dark and even and the smell rose into the small room. She poured the new mix into a stone bowl. She set it on the bench beside Chayan. Then she sat down, and she did not begin. The microblade Vichy had given her was in her belt. She drew it out and turned it in her hand. It was finer than any blade she had ever held, the edge so true it caught the light along its whole length without a single nick or tremor. She set it on the bench. She picked up a pestle from the shelf, weighed it in her palm, set it back. She picked up the bone tool for the ochre. She set it down. She stood up. She walked the 4 paces to the bench where the 2 mourning skulls waited to be returned with enclosure D, and she bent over one of them, Ayler, who had died in the autumn before last, and looked at the groove Saral had cut years ago. She picked up a fine flint and ran it along one of the grooves, retracing it. The groove did not need retracing. She caught herself a few strokes in. She set the flint down very carefully, as though it had grown heavy. She went back to Chayan's bench. She sat. She did not begin. The bowl of fresh ochre sat between them. Chayan's empty sockets were turned slightly toward the entry, as Saral had set him, so the light would fall on the work. Naren had known him all her life. He had taught her how to find a particular small bird's nest in the crook of a particular pistachio tree. He had laughed once, very hard, at something she had said when she was a child, and the laugh had made her feel for the rest of that day that she was a person who could say things. He was a kind dead. He was waiting to be carried forward. She put her hands flat on her knees. Something fell from her belt onto the floor between her feet. She looked down. It was a pistachio shell, half a one, smooth-edged from a meal long enough ago that she could not remember the meal. She did not remember putting it into her belt. She did not remember when it had gone in. She picked it up and held it in her palm and turned it. There were others. She knew it before she looked. She drew her belt forward and shook it gently into her lap, and out came the pistachio shell and a small chip of greenstone she did not remember finding, and the lark's feather Michal had shown her at dawn. Michal had tucked it into the pouch at her own waist, but somehow it had come into Naren's belt instead, and Naren did not remember the moment of its passing, and a flake of debitage from Veshi's floor, the kind of thing a person walks out with on the sole of a foot, and the new microblade. She looked at them a long time. She had been gathering. She had not known she was gathering. Each thing had come into her hand, and her hand had kept it, the way a hand keeps a thing when the rest of the person is not looking. The hand had been doing the work the rest of her had not been able to do. The hand had been saying, here, this and this and this. Hold these, do not let go of these. The world was still here. She was still here. Hold on. She put the small things back into her belt one by one. The microblade last. She did not put the pistachio shell back. She kept that one in her palm. The light in the floor square had moved. The afternoon was turning. She looked at Cyan. She looked at the bowl. She thought of Saral's hand on her own. The winter achette was prepared. The way the older woman had guided the drill through the bone, slow, slow, until the bit broke through into the inside of the skull, and the small, hollow click had come, and Saral had said nothing, only held the drill steady a moment more, so that Naren's hand could feel that it had done the thing. She did not pick up the bone tool. She did not pick up the brush. Instead, she reached for the cloth that hung on the peg by the bench, the soft, worn cloth Saral used to cover bowls when the work was paused. She laid it over the fresh ochre. She smoothed it once. The dark of the pigment showed faintly through. She stood. Her knees were stiff from the sitting. She went out into the changing afternoon light. Outside, voices were rising in a different rhythm. The scouts had brought their certainty down through the village, and people were beginning to move. The drive would begin tomorrow at dawn. The path down to the great cistern took her past the lower roofs, where women were already lifting baskets onto their heads and calling to one another about the dawn. The certainty had rearranged the village in the small way it always did, not hurry, but a tightening of attention, the way a rope tightens when a hand takes hold of its far end. Naren walked through it without belonging to it. The water vessel on her hip was empty. She had taken it from its peg in the workspace because she needed an errand for her hands, and the cistern was the longest errand the late afternoon could give her. The cistern lay where the bedrock dipped 25 feet across, hewn down through pale stone almost as deep as a tall man could stand twice over. The channels ran into it along grooves worn smooth by years of running rain, chiseled into living rock by hands that had asked the ridge for a thing the ridge did not give freely. There was no spring on this summit. The water was sky. It had fallen during winter rains and was held now against the dry months in a basin that was the oldest such basin anywhere in the world, though no one alive would have framed it that way. To the people of the ridge it was simply the water. They had cut it. It held. They drank. Michal was already at the rim, on her belly, chin on her arms, watching. The child's small back rose and fell with her breathing. The pouch at her hip was unstrung, its contents spilled on the bedrock beside her. Feathers, a fragment of bone, 2 pistachio shells, a curl of grass, a small museum of a small day. Michal was watching the water for ducks. They came down sometimes in the evening, dropping out of the long sky to drink, and a child who watched long enough was sometimes given them. Naren let her water vessel rest on the rim. The stone was warm from the day. She sat. Michal looked up, smiled, and went back to watching. For a long while they did not speak. The wind moved across the cistern surface and broke the reflection of the pale sky into bright fragments and let it knit again. A goose called very far off. Below them and behind, the percussion of grindstones had not stopped. It never stopped, only thinned in the late hours and thickened in the morning, and the sound came up the slope as a kind of weather. After a time, Michal sat up. She reached into her pouch and lifted out 2 things. One was a duck's wing covert, blue-gray with a thin barred edge, the kind a child finds at a waterline and treasures. The other was a scrap of down, soft as a breath, faintly ochreous along one edge. Vulture down, picked up at the edge of the burial pit on the far side of the ridge where the bones were laid out for the birds. Michal turned the down between her fingers a moment. Then she pressed it into Naren's palm and closed Naren's fingers over it, the way one closes a small lid. "For Naren," she said. She went back to her watching. Naren held the down in her closed hand. She had been picking up small things all day. Without meaning to, she had been gathering them. A shell here, a blade there, the tools she did not need. And now a child had given her one. A child had handed her the thing rather than letting her take it. The pattern shifted under her so quietly she almost did not feel it shift. She opened her hand. The down was paler than she had thought, almost silver in this light, with that thread of ochre along one edge where it had touched the earth at the burial pit. She thought of Pillar 43, the headless figure, the spread wings, the disk balanced on a feather. She had walked past it that morning. She had touched it. She put the down carefully into the inner fold of her belt where nothing would crush it. Michal had not turned. The ducks had not come. After a while, Naren rose, dipped the water vessel, and lifted it onto her hip full. The cistern accepted the small disturbance without complaint, the surface knitting again. She rested her free hand briefly on Michal's hair. Michal made a small, contented sound, but did not look up. Naren walked back up toward the rooftops. They ate in the household at the usual hour. Coarse porridge from the long-handled bowl, a little dried meat, pistachios cracked between 2 stones. Hari, Saral's husband, talked of the drive. Doruk, their small son, ate with the grave attention children give food. The talk moved around Naren and let her be quiet, which was a kindness and was meant as one. She did not finish her portion. She set the bowl aside. When the others had laid out their sleeping mats and the lamp had been trimmed low, Naren rose again and went to the niche. It was set into the inner wall of the small house, a hollow above the height of a kneeling person, lined with a flat slab of incised stone. Eshet rested in it. 2 winters now. Saral had guided Naren's hand on the drill the day they prepared her. Slow, slow, the bit through the bone, the small hollow click of breakthrough. And afterwards they had laid her ochre on together, temple to temple, and threaded the cord, and looped it over the small wooden peg in the niche, and Saral had stepped back and let Naren be the one who set her in. Eshet had been 4 years old. Naren did not kneel. She sat cross-legged on the floor below the niche, the way she had always sat to be near her. The small ledge below it held a pistachio Michal had set there days ago, and forgotten, or not forgotten, only set down in the certainty that it would be allowed to stay. Naren looked at the pistachio, then she lifted the down out of her belt and laid it on the ledge beside it. The down rested, the pistachio rested. They looked side by side, like 2 small offerings made by 2 different sets of hands across 2 different days, and that was what they were. She did not pray. She did not speak to Eshet. There had never been words for that work. There had only been the doing of it, the keeping of the cord taut, the ochre fresh, the niche kept clean. She sat with her hands open on her knees and let the lamp burn its slow yellow burn at the edge of her vision. Something had begun to move at the edge of her mind that was not yet a thought. It had to do with Sayan and with Eshet and with the way her hands had done the right work for 2 years and now, in this season, had stopped. The trouble was not in Sayan's bones, which were good bones and ready bones, and not in the loss of Eshet, which was held, settled, a sorrow that had taken its place in the household the way Eshet had taken her place in the niche. The trouble was in her. It was in her own hands. It was in some small part of her that had carried the work for 2 winters and had come, in this 3rd season, to the edge of what one person could carry alone. She did not have words for it. The shape of it was only just beginning to be visible to her, the way the shape of an animal coming through dusk is first only a movement and then a darkness against another darkness, and only finally a creature with a body. She sat with the not knowing. Outside, the wind moved across the flat roof and into the rope-bound thatch, and a small voice, Doruk dreaming, said something soft and stopped. After a long time, she lay down on her mat. The microblade Veshi had given her was still in her belt. She did not take it out. She slept with her hand resting against where it lay, the way a hand rests against a thing it has been told to hold. Before dawn, the village began to wake. The hunters had gone before first light. By the time Naren rose from her mat, the rooftops were already alive with the small, purposeful movement of a day that had begun in the dark. Fires built up, water set to warm, grindstones brought out from where they had rested overnight. Michal's father had gone with the dawn party. Saral's older brother had gone. The men carried their long shafts wrapped in hide against the dew, the flint points seated and lashed and checked, and they had moved off the ridge in a quiet line that the watchers on the rooftops had followed with their eyes until the line dropped below the slope and was gone. The drive itself was miles below. The migration came each year along the long, shallow valley to the west, and the hunters knew the bend of it the way Yelet knew the bend of her rope. They would gather above the herd on the high ground and turn it into the narrow place where the older men waited. The work of the morning on the ridge was the work of preparation. Everything that came up the slope at evening would have to be met. Naren went down to the workyard. The percussion of grindstones was already steady, a wide, soft pulse under everything. 6 women at the long line of stones, then 8, then more, the handstones turning and turning in the bowls of basalt, einkorn going to coarse meal in slow handfuls. The stone troughs along the wall had been scrubbed and set ready. Baskets of pistachio wood had been brought up from the store and stacked beside the hearths. The shaft straighteners had been laid out on a roof in the sun in case any of the returning hunters needed them, though by this point in the season the shafts had long been true. Saral was at the end of the long line, sleeves pushed back, hands moving in the rhythm she had moved in since girlhood. Naren took the place beside her without speaking and set her own handstone into the bowl. The grain went under. Her shoulders found the old shape. For a long while there was only the work and the wide, soft pulse of the yard and the smoke beginning to rise from the readied fires. They did not speak of Cheyenne. They did not speak of the bowl under its cloth. The work spoke for them, and the work was enough. By mid-morning the first runner came up the slope. He came at a steady lope, the gait of a man who had paced himself across difficult ground, and when he reached the edge of the yard, he stopped with his hands on his knees and gave his news between breaths. The herd had come into the valley as expected. The turn had been made. The narrow place was holding. The older men were at their work. He drank from the gourd handed to him and went back down, and the yard took the news in without breaking rhythm, and the grindstones went on. Tepe stood on the high vantage above the yard, where he had stood for many seasons of many drives, his gaze along the line of the valley. He did not need to be down there. His knees would not have carried him down there now, in any case. From where he stood, he could see the small shapes of the watchers on the far ridge, and he could read by their stillness that the work below was steady. He stayed. Yellet had come up and stood near him for a while and had gone back to the edge of the workyard where she watched the children, Mihal among them, carrying water, without saying what she watched for. A second runner at midday. The drive had gone well. The count was good. The carcasses would come up the slope in the late afternoon on the wooden sledges hauled by ropes, the way everything on this ridge was hauled. The light by then had shifted off the bedrock of the upper yard and onto the back wall, where it lay in a long pale band along the limestone, and the smell that rose from the readied troughs was the smell of pistachio wood not yet hot enough to flame, only the resinous breath of it warming. The yard moved into the second part of its day. The hearths were brought to coals. The troughs were filled, the porridge set, the long flint blades laid out on cloths. Saral worked without hurry, and the women working with her took her pace, and the pace was the right pace. It was in this part of the afternoon that Saral, without looking up, reached to the cloth where the blades were laid and chose one, a particular blade, longer than the others, with a fine, even edge, and held it out toward Naren. She did not say what it was for. She did not need to. The cut it would make was a cut for the joint at the haunch, a clean cut, the kind of cut that mattered, and Saral had handed her this same blade for this same cut at the preparation of Échette 2 winters ago. The hand remembered, the hand that received remembered. Naren took the blade. Saral's hand was already back at her own work. Nothing was said, but something passed between them in that moment that was not nothing, and Naren felt it go through her like water finding a channel, and she set the blade down beside her and went on grinding until the carcasses came. They came in the long gold of late afternoon, hauled up the slope on the sledges. the ropes biting into the shoulders of the men who pulled them. The yard rose to meet the work. The blades were taken up. The first cuts were made. The fires were brought to the right heat, and the first roasts went on to the pistachio coals, and the smoke that rose was the smoke that this ridge had risen each year at this season for longer than anyone could count. Tepe came down at the end of the light. He spoke a few practical words to Saral about the burial, that the filling would begin the day after the feast, that the carried forward dead would be set in their places before, and he went on to his own household. Saral nodded. Naren, working a little apart, heard. The two specialists in permanence had understood each other, and the day was settling into its evening, and the feast was almost upon them. By full dark the fires had taken the village. Not one fire, many. Hearths along the rooftops glowed in a scattered constellation that mirrored, dimly, the harder constellation overhead. The central yard was an orange basin of light. Long stone troughs steamed at their lips, the porridge inside them thick and slow turning, and the women who tended them stirred with wooden paddles longer than their arms. Baskets of fine wheat flour cakes, broken into pieces small enough to share, passed from hand to hand. The cakes were rare. Most days the grain came coarse and went into the troughs as porridge, and the porridge fed everyone the same. But tonight there was fine flour, ground twice and sifted, and the cakes had been baked on flat stones beside the coals, and to break one open was to take in hand a thing that had cost many hours of slow, careful grinding by women whose arms were tired now, and who ate the cakes themselves with the quiet pride of work shown rather than spoken. The roasts came off the pistachio coals in their own time, gazelle first, the meat of the day's drive, dressed and quartered and set to the fires while the light still held, and then the older aurochs, flesh that had been turning since the hunt before. The smoke of pistachio wood hung sweet over everything, threading through the smell of fat and singed hair and the yeasty sour of beer. The beer moved in stone bowls from one circle to the next. It was not strong. It was grainy on the tongue, sour at the back of it, and it left a coarse warmth low in the belly. The bowls were heavy and unbeautiful, the kind of bowls that lived their lives between troughs and mouths and did not need to be lovely. People drank in long, slow pulls and passed them on. People had come in from the country around. Some had walked many days. There were faces in the firelight that Naren had not seen since the last feast, and faces she had never seen at all. A man with a marine shell at his throat who had come from somewhere far enough that the shell had passed through 3 or 4 sets of hands before reaching his. A woman with greenstone beads at her wrists who sat among the elder women of the bird clan as though she had always sat there. The strangers were not strangers exactly. They were the wider world arriving, as it arrived each year at this season, and being folded back into the body of the place. Michal sat at the center of a knot of children, holding her pouch of feathers open on her lap. She was naming. "The lark," she said, touching the small brown one. "The duck, the wing covered, iridescent in the firelight. The crane. The vulture. The down of it now lying on a small ledge in Naren's house, and a longer down feather still in the pouch." The children leaned in. One of them, smaller, asked the name of a feather Michal did not know, and Michal held it to the light and said she did not know yet, and the smaller child accepted this as the right answer. Vashi was at the edge of the yard with 3 other nappers, drinking more than he drank at his bench and laughing at something one of them had said. His hands rested on his knees. They were quiet hands tonight. They had done their work and were allowed to be still. Saral sat with Hari and Doruk beside one of the smaller fires, the 3 of them eating from a single broad bowl. Doruk's small fingers pressed into the porridge, and then into his mouth, and then, gravely, into his mother's. Saral did not mind. She broke a piece of cake for him. Naren ate. She drank a little. She found, after a while, that her body wanted to be away from the fires. She set down her bowl, stood, climbed past the upper rooftops, past the last hearth, and up onto the high outcrop above the village where the air was colder and the light from the fires fell away. Tepe was already there. She had thought he might be. He was sitting on the flat stone that he sat on most evenings in the warm seasons, and when she came up, he gestured slightly with one hand without turning, and she sat beside him. The view from the outcrop ran south and east, the steppe falling away in long folds toward the horizon. In starlight, the land was the color of bone. Far off, where the sky met the world, the land continued past where any walking person had ever walked, toward Syria, toward the south, toward the places where, the traders said, other peoples were beginning to plant. The ridge had heard of this. The ridge had thought about it. The ridge had not crossed. For a long time neither of them spoke. The wind moved over them. Then Tepe said the 7-meter pillar. He said it the way an old man says a thing he has carried too long to carry tightly. The day the flaw opened, he said. He had been at one end of the rope and Iruk had been at the other, and they had felt the stone change under their hands before they saw it, a long, quiet shift in the way the weight rode the rope, and they had set it down. They had stood there with their hands on it. They had walked around it. Iruk had been the one to say it first. They would leave it, and they had left it. It was still there, Tepe said. It would be there when he was no longer there. He had thought about that walking away all his life. He had thought when he was younger that it had been a defeat. He had thought when he was older that it had been the right call. He had come now to think, and here he stopped and looked out toward the dark south, that it had been the most important thing he had ever done at the quarry. Not the pillars he had raised, the one he had laid down. He did not look at her when he said this. He said it to the horizon. Naren held the words. She did not answer for a long time. The wind moved. Below them the feast was a low murmur of fires and voices and the occasional rise of laughter. She said, finally, the name. Chayan. Just the name. Tepe nodded. He did not turn. He did not ask. They sat. After a while he said he would sit a little longer. She understood that this was how he meant to be left. She rose. She went down the slope past the upper hearths, past the children still around Mihal, past Saral, and the bowl shared 3 ways, past Vashi, who did not see her go. She did not turn toward her household. She turned toward the workspace where the bowl still stood under its cloth. The lamp was where she had left it. She lit it from a coal carried in a small clay-lined hollow of stone, and the flame took, and the workspace came up out of the dark in the soft way it always did. The benches, the shelves, the row of skulls, each on its own marked place, the bowl under its cloth. She lifted the cloth. The pigment beneath had thickened and darkened at the edges. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it aside on the lower shelf and reached for the dry ochre and the small stone dish of rendered fat. She mixed it fresh. She did not hurry. The fat had the smell Saral had taught her to know, the particular animal, the particular rendering, the way it took the red and held it without separating. She worked the pigment with the flat of a small bone tool until the color was even and the consistency was right. She wet her finger and touched the surface. She tasted the air above it. It was right. She moved Chayan's bench under the lamp. He had been a quiet man. He had taught the boys the names of birds. He had sat on a flat roof in the late sun with his eyes closed for whole afternoons in the last summer of his living, and no one had disturbed him. Saral had defleshed him with a steady hand in the days after his death, and the grooves had been cut then, the deep parallel grooves running front to back, evenly spaced, the small drill hole worked through with a perforator turned between the palms. Vaishi's microblades had done the cutting. The bone had taken the work cleanly. Saral had said so at the time, that the bone was good, that he had kept himself well. What remained was the ochre. Naren took up the small bone tool again, and she began. She worked from the temple. The first stroke laid the color along the line of the brow, where the bone had been scraped and was waiting. The pigment took. She drew it back along the curve, slow, even, the way Saral had drawn it on Eshet 2 winters ago, with Naren's hand under hers, learning the pressure. She did not think of Eshet now. She thought of the bone in front of her. She thought of where the color needed to be and where it did not. She thought of the cord that would come after, and the toggle she had already cut, and the second toggle she had cut as a spare, both of them waiting in the small basket by her knee. Her hands worked. She did not notice when Saral came in. She felt the change in the air at the doorway, the small shift of light, but she did not look up. The work was inside her hands now, and she would not lift them out of it. Saral did not speak. There was the soft sound of a stone vessel being set down on the bench beside her. Water, fresh, brought from the cistern. Then the soft sound of Saral going out again. The doorway returned to itself. Naren did not stop. The pigment moved from the temple along the brow, down across the cheekbone, along the jaw, around to the other temple. She turned the skull on its bench when she needed to. She rested when she needed to. Once she set the tool down and pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes and held them there, and then she took the tool up again. The lamp burned. The ochre held. When the color was complete, she let it sit. She drank a little of the water Saral had left. She took up the cord, flax, twisted tight, the length she had measured days ago, and she threaded it through the suspension hole. She fitted the small wooden toggle on the inside, the one she had cut first. She tested the weight against her palm. The cord held. The toggle held. The lower jaw, lashed into its place, sat the way it was meant to sit. She lifted Cheyenne and turned him slowly in her hands. The ochre was even. The cord was true. She set him on the shelf with the carried forward dead. The second toggle, the spare, she left in the basket at her knee. By the time she stepped out of the workspace, the morning was full, and the village was already moving toward the dip in the hillside. People were carrying baskets. People were carrying nothing, only walking. The grindstones had quieted. The drive's meat was set aside under hide covers in the cool stone hollows. Today no one was working at anything but this. She walked down with them. At enclosure D, the entry above had been opened wide. The light came down into the interior in a column. Saral was already inside, kneeling by the central pillars with the two interred skulls beside her, and as Naren came to the entry above, she saw Saral place the first one, careful, two-handed, in the small space at the foot of the pillar where it would rest until the rubble rose around it and held it there. The second went a few paces away in its own place. Saral set them as she had set them all her life. She did not look up. Tepe and Yelet were at the upper edge of the gathering. They stood close, not touching, the way two people stand who have walked a ridge together for 40 years. Yelet had her flax fiber rope wound around her wrist still, though there was no measuring to do. Tepe had a basket at his feet. He was watching the pillars. The first basket of rubble went in. It was Vashi who carried it. He came up from the slope with the basket on his shoulder, and he tipped it slowly at the lip of the entry, and the rubble went down inside with a long, soft rattle and settled at the foot of the wall. The sound was not loud. It was the sound of small stones finding their places. Then another basket came up, and another. The men and women came in turn. No one hurried. No one called instruction. The rubble found its level and began to climb. Naren stood near Saral now. She had come down inside on the upper tier of the bench, and Saral had moved up to stand beside her, and they watched the rubble rise together. The pillars stood as they had stood, the fox on the side of one, the vulture on the side of another, the painted boar in his red and white and black, the colors still holding after all the seasons he had stood here. The rubble rose toward his feet. Michal came down from the slope and stood beside Naren without ceremony. She fitted herself under Naren's arm. She watched. After a while, she handed Naren a small thing from her pouch. Not the down, not the lark feather, something Naren had not seen before, a small, smooth river pebble worn flat. She did not say what it was. Naren held it. When Naren crouched once to help lift a basket, the pistachio shell that had been in her belt for days slipped out and landed at her feet. She looked at it. It was just a shell. She picked it up. She held it in her closed hand for a moment. Then, when the basket she had helped lift came to the lip and the rubble went down, she opened her hand and let the shell fall in with it. It went in among the small stones and was gone. Michal saw her do it. Michal did not ask. Across the gathering, Yelet had been watching the children on the slope, and her watching had settled now on Michal in particular, quiet, steady, the way a person watches a thing they have already decided to attend to without yet having said so. Tepe noticed Yelet's looking. He did not comment. He bent and lifted his own basket and carried it up to the lip and tipped it in. The rubble climbed. The faceless heads of the central pillars still rose clear of it, into the open air above. They would rise clear for some days yet. The work was not the work of a morning. It would go on tomorrow and the day after. By the time it was finished, the pillars would be under the earth and the place would be sealed on its own keeping. The afternoon came on. The first day of the burial closed. Late light on the ridge. The limestone went gold at the edges, and the long view to the south opened out the way it opened every clear evening, the steppe running away toward Syria in soft bands of dust and shadow. There was no place in this country from which more of the world could be seen. In the dip below, Enclosure D sat half-buried. The lower thirds of the pillars had vanished into rubble during the day's work. The faceless heads still rose clear into the open air, patient as if waiting their turn. The carved fox on one shaft, the cranes on another, the snake winding down a third, all still visible, all already going. Tepe sat on his outcrop above. He had sat there many evenings of his life. Saral came along the ridge path toward home and saw him and nodded as she passed, and he nodded back, and neither stopped. There was nothing to say that the day had not already said. In the workyard, Yelet stood a little apart from the children. Michal was sorting feathers in the last light, laying them out on a flat stone in some order of her own. Yelet asked her quietly the name of one she did not recognize, a small barred thing, brown and white. Michal told her. Yelet listened. Michal went on sorting. Yelet stayed. In the small house Naren sat near Eshet's niche. The vulture down was still on the ledge where she had placed it, and Michal's pistachio beside it. She took from her belt the second wooden toggle, the spare she had cut and not used, and set it on the ledge with the other things, a thing she had made and laid down. She rested her hand a moment on the stone of the wall. The lamp burned low. Outside, the wind moved across the steppe as it had moved across the steppe before any of them were born. The grinding stone percussion in the village had slowed to its evening rhythm and then to nothing. Smoke rose from the rooftops and was carried off. Below the ridge, in the dip, the pillars stood half-covered, their carved animals passing slowly into the dark of rubble. They would wait there. The community on this ridge would not become farmers. In time they would scatter, or thin, or go quietly into the world they had declined to join, and the place would be sealed and forgotten, and the earth would rise over it. They did not know this. They knew only that the work had been done well, and that the place had been laid down the way a good thing is laid down, with care in its season by hands that had learned. The ridge held what it had always held. The pillars slept.